Ask it.
Ask it.
Ask it.
Ask it.
Ask it.
Welcome to the Ask It podcast. The Ask It podcast encourages talking about talking, facilitates your own inner wisdom, and rather than providing answers, considers good questions.
So, hi everyone, welcome to the Ask It podcast. Today's Ask It question is general questions all about drugs, both legal and currently illegal, and how they might be useful, not useful, in terms of mental health issues. And our guest today is Adam Knowles, who is an existential psychotherapist. And so over to you, Adam. How would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm an existential psychotherapist. I guess that it triggers the first question: what does that mean? I tend to say that it's a kind of philosophical approach to psychotherapy, sort of rather than a medical one. Primarily, it's within the. If this is seen by any psychotherapy trainees, for instance, then it might be useful to say it's within the humanistic, rather than psychoanalytic or psychodynamic schools. But for the layperson, it just means that it's a general conversation between me and somebody else in a room or a couple. And then I also do group work as well. So I started a group recently, a therapy group for psychedelic explorers, which is in its infancy as well. And then that's about half my week. And then the other half is conducting my PhD really, which is a vehicle for my research into the Amazonian plant medicine ayahuasca, which is a serotonergic psychedelic. And we may talk about that a bit more, but just in brief, that's I'm trying to contribute to a growing body of researchers and knowledge that's gaining some momentum into the use of psychedelics to enhance well-being and people's lives generally in safe settings. So those are the two things I'm doing: a psychotherapist and a psychedelic researcher.
So how much are you able to talk about your PhD?
Endlessly.
Oh, good, great. So what's your kind of jumping off point? So you've said that you're focusing on ayahuasca, which I really want to get into maybe a bit later in our conversation.
Yeah.
So what's your jumping off point for your PhD?
The problem, in a sense, the problem I'm trying to address in my research is one of, in a sense, the limits of current approaches. So that's not just psychiatry and psychiatric drugs, but it's psychotherapy, talking therapies, anything that we try to use to help people, whether that's body therapies, talking therapies, drugs, or prescribed drugs in that sense, that there appears to be some prospect of the therapeutic potential of this new field of psychedelics. And that's something that there's a lot of quantitative research, as in numbers-based research, kind of scales and graphs and brain scans. What I can bring to it, and that's great for those that can bring that to it, but it's not my forte, or it's not my choice, let's say. What I hope to bring to it is, as a psychotherapist, someone who has trained in elucidating someone's experience in dialogue. I am a qualitative researcher, which means I conduct interviews and use words rather than numbers. And so I hope to get into provide a kind of much deeper, richer description and analysis of people's experience with psychedelics and what they find helpful. So it's twofold. It's we seem to be not. One way to put it is that we're hitting the limits of our existing modalities, particularly in psychiatry, and then there's this prospect of a new horizon that's created by psychedelics, and it's to try and help civilization, that's that too broad, walk across that bridge into a new space that's perhaps a slightly different understanding than we currently have.
Brilliant, absolutely fascinating. So if we kind of just backpedal a bit, how did you end up? So can you kind of give a potted history of your journey to ending up here?
Yeah. Well, as an existentialist, I don't consider that we end up anywhere. I am here, and obviously I know why you're saying that. But it's all everything changes, as we found this year, and
Goodness
I
me,
know.
yes.
And I know that everything will change again. But in terms of the potted history of what's happened to me, I started off in Manchester. I was I had a fairly working class sort of upbringing, which puts me a little bit. I feel sometimes a bit out of place, or have a bit of imposter syndrome in terms of the middle classness of psychotherapy and academia. Actually, on the other
Yeah,
hand,
yeah.
so I'm starting to get over. Do you ever get over it? I'm learning to deal with that in a certain way. I'm learning to own what I am able to do. I'm not able to do everything, but I am able to do some things, bring something to the party.
Mm.
And what I was bringing to the party of the world up until 6 or 7 years ago, roughly, was marketing, advertising. Like anybody, I wanted to survive in the world, and my way of doing that was by selling things. I was a technologist. I was working to sell little pots of yogurt and cars, and I was making websites and digital marketing, basically, which I really enjoyed. And towards the end of that career, which I now think of as that career, I was mainly working for charities. So I'd started to finesse it a bit, and was really happy working for Shelter, the homelessness charity, and other the Prince's Teaching Institute, as it was then. So there were some moves there, but I found it wasn't enough in terms of kind of self-actualizations, to put it that way, of
Yeah.
mine. I guess I didn't want to die with my project still in me. I wanted to put it out in the world. And part of my realization towards that was my own psychedelic journeys, particularly ayahuasca. And that was quite transformative for me. Obviously, it may be obvious, but it's worth saying that it's because of the psychedelics' effect on me and my experiences with it that I am now interested. That it's had quite a It's contributed to a transformative effect, amongst other things. Amazing people I've met, some amazing teachers and tutors and inspiration, whether that's Alan Watts or just the people that were on the course at the psychotherapy college. And through all of that, over the past 5 or 6 years, I've done a bit of a handbrake turn. I feel I've not left the old me behind. I still brought all of that with me. I mean, even doing this, it's video, it's on camera, there's still digital technology involved.
Mhm.
But what is it for became a really urgent question for me when I was about, I don't know, early 30s, bit of a sort of early midlife crisis. I've since sort of learned that it's all a crisis. It's all an existential crisis from
Yeah,
the moment you're born to the day you die. You're
yeah,
in a midlife crisis, and to lean into that and to take it seriously, and sometimes make some big decisions, which for me meant throwing a bunch of money at training and becoming poor because I earn a lot less money as a psychotherapist than I
yeah,
ever did in that lucrative career. But I am so much happier, Lucinda. I can't tell you how much happier I am in my daily life in terms of that sort of sense of fulfillment. And for me, it's not really about helping people or giving back. It's actually almost quite selfish that I just love talking to people. It's a privilege every day. I learn things, they get something out of it, they tell me, they keep coming back, most of them. And so there's just something really fulfilling about that makes me think that I'm on the right track, even though, as I've said, the idea of there being a track is itself one that I'd question.
yeah. And I think that's where you and I resonated, wasn't it? In our preliminary communications by email or
Yeah.
chatting, it was about that we both absolutely love talking to people, and
Yeah.
we don't know, who's going to see this or how big or small it's going to be. But I think I can speak for both of us. It was more about let's just share some ideas and really
Yeah.
enjoy talking to people. And I think
Yeah.
one of the other areas that we kind of met in was this idea that traditionally, I can only speak for myself, but I feel traditionally there's been this attitude about talking therapies that it works for everybody. Everybody should be doing it. It's
Yeah.
and it was limited to our field. No, it's just talking therapy, and there's very rigid boundaries around that. What we do and what we don't do, and this idea of just sitting in a chair, and all of that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we were saying, weren't we, that the world has moved on. We're living in completely different times. I mean, yeah, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and we need to know all that theory, as we've said. But the
Mm.
world is very different, and there's so much more helpful, useful, innovative things available to us. And I think that was kind of what we were talking about, that we want to be able to expand the field and bring in whatever's going to help at the end of the day. And it can't just be
Yeah.
limited to sitting in your chair talking. Um, and
I think there's a real place for that. I think that, I'm a psychotherapist, and what I
for
do
sure,
is psychotherapist.
me too.
And I'm a massive believer in the benefits of that was Freud's innovation, that actually it's extraordinary the difference it can make. But
Talking
you're
and
right. I'm
listening. Yeah,
talking and listening. Yeah,
yeah,
particularly the listening part.
yes,
Um, so that's all true. But what about the rest? Yeah. If psychotherapy is mind based, then what about body, and what about the rest of the person? We're all sat on Zoom where you can't see below here,
oh gosh,
and it kind of it's almost sarcastically kind of prodding us at the direction that we've gone in, that we've moved away from a kind of full 3D sense of a visceral being. And ayahuasca, for instance, doesn't let you get away with that for very long. When
yeah,
you're on your knees vomiting in a bucket in Costa Rica, as I've been, the mind and its connection to this stuff, this matter, this material, this muscle and bone, is much more obvious. So I sort of trust my clients that they can marry the two, that I can provide them an existential analysis of talking and mind based. But yes, Lucinda, the limits of that is it's only going to be part of the picture for them, and their job. I see it's their job more than my job. It's
yeah,
not for me to advise them or suggest this or that. You should try psilocybin. You should go for a massage. I don't tend to do that. I trust them that they will make the right decision, and that I provide them a contractual thing which is in itself self-contained, and then they have them a whole smorgasbord of human experience beyond that.
yeah, great. Okay, so um, current prescription drugs. Let's start there. What's
Hmm.
your view of antidepressants, antipsychotics, etc.? Where do you kind of sit with that?
Well, Nietzsche said this far more depends on what things are called than what they are. So I was thinking about that recently, and I was thinking in terms of Lucy Johnston and the power threat meaning framework, for instance, which starts to take it's not anti-psychiatry. That's the first thing to say, but it's a critique. It's a critique and an offering of a better way. That's also important, perhaps more important. That it doesn't just kind of discard one metaphor. It suggests another. That, for instance, when you talk about antidepressant, what did you say? Antidepressant,
Psychotic?
antipsychotic. They're labeled as if they are addressing a entity that's called depression or anxiety, and it fails to acknowledge that to anybody, including professionals or people suffering with these things, these are abstractions, and what they're abstractions of is behavior, and yet they're treated as if they are something wrong with the brain and
Yeah,
something material, as if there is a part of the brain that's diseased
yeah,
effectively. And then the offer is that these pills address that chemical imbalance or disease of a neurological disease. But if it was a neurological disease, you would be able to detect it neurologically, which you can't. You can't. No one's ever been able to show me a brain scan that shows. They say, "Well, this brain's different to that brain," but that doesn't mean that you can. No one via that mechanism. All of these things, depression, anxiety, and even psychosis, they're diagnosed by subjectively by someone sat opposite another person with a checklist, which is from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, usually in America, or the ICD-10 or 11 in Europe, and they're just assessed by a person, by another human, against what they think is going on for the other person. So it's not very scientific, really, and so. Yeah, so my view is that there is a trick of language happening there when you treat something that's an abstraction as if it's concrete. You treat depression, which is an abstraction, as if it's a thing that then can then be addressed by a pill. And that, I say this as someone who spent 20 years in marketing, is marketing. That is the GlaxoSmithKlines of the world. That is there. It's very persuasive. It's very easy to believe. It's a bit of a kind of opiate for the masses. And I think. So I think these prescription drugs can be very helpful for people. I've had lots of clients for whom it serves them, but the ones for whom it works are the people that know what it is. Is it an analgesic that reduces pain? Is it a neuroleptic that induces sleep? Though that's what the drug actually does. That's a drug-based action, not a disease-based action that is operating on depression, which it just isn't. And it's transparent to anybody that looks into it for more than 5 minutes that that's not what it is, and yet that's what it's called. And I don't see a lot of activity from psychiatry, GPs, doctors, or the medical profession to debunk that misunderstanding.
Yeah, well, because I think it's simpler, isn't it? It's simpler that way.
Yeah.
So I suppose my point is, with those big hitters, anxiety and depression, which take up most of our caseload in one way or another, I think they're just so awful, and the suffering is just so extreme, isn't it? That it's easy to just snatch at the first life ring that's thrown to you, really. And wouldn't it be brilliant if that was the answer? I would just pop a pill for a few weeks and that solves all problems. And I think it was beautifully articulate what you said there. And the thing that gets missed is the context, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are you the same in a different environment? Are you the same around different people? What helps you feel better? What makes things worse? All of that kind of gets lost in that. But of course, that takes time and effort. And, if I'm going to be a bit challenging, it means that somebody's got to take responsibility for their own journey. And I loved what you said at the top of our session that, I think that was a brave thing to say, that actually it's not about helping people because you trust your clients, the people that come to you, to work that out for themselves. But that does mean that they've got to take a level of responsibility for that. And I think,
so that's it. Responsibility with support is, I guess, what I'd say.
Yeah, beautiful. And so over time, over the decades, I think we've kind of been programmed into this place where you give all your power over to an expert who makes a diagnosis and then, administers the appropriate intervention, whether that be drugs or whatever it is. And actually, when it comes to such subtle areas of human experience, really only you know how you feel, and from day to day, from minute to minute, from hour to hour. So I think there's a lot of factors that make medication an attractive route. But you and I know most of the time doesn't really solve the problem. I think it's good in acute cases. Where maybe somebody's suffering so much that they can't even think whether they want a cup of tea. So how are you going to do any other work if you can't get into that calm space?
With informed consent, anything is okay, really. With adult informed consent, and that includes prescription drugs. If they know what the action is, and you're right. I imagine it would then be more useful in acute cases or for short-term use. If you've got a presentation and you want to take some anti-anxiety or something that slows down your heart or something, I totally understand that. Or if indeed you've got an essay to write and you need to focus, then you might want to take something that reduces your ADHD. All of that makes sense to me, but what doesn't make sense, exactly as you say, is the structural elements where it's kind of the position of I know what's best for you. just philosophically doesn't sit with me.
No, me neither. Okay, so can we move from that into um, different purposes, aims, goals of therapy, the role of psychedelics? If we can just kind of introduce that, how would you start talking about that?
The only thing I can say, this might be a short section, because the only thing I can say about it is the aims and goals of psychotherapy or psychedelic use are entirely up to the person taking them. I just don't have a view. I can say from the research what people tend to do. I kind of can give you a descriptive view of what they end up saying and doing, but it's not a prescription. So that would be a description, not a prescription. So I don't have any view of what it should be used for. My basic argument is towards freedom. Again, it's quite an existential thing. It's towards freedom, and freedom of particularly to do with your body, whatever you want to do with your body, if it doesn't affect anybody else. So yeah, so that's what I'd say. So what's your response to that, Lucinda? Where would you want me to go with it?
Yeah, well, I suppose that the thorny issue first that we have to get over is, of course, lots of these drugs that we're going to be talking about are illegal currently
Yeah,
in this country.
yeah,
And
yeah,
um,
yeah,
you know, you would know more, but from your literature review, we know that in the 50s and 60s, there were some wonderful experiments, with Groff and others looking at the role of LSD, etc. There was wonderful work being done back
yeah,
in those days. And then, of course, these things were made illegal and all research was stopped. And now, uh, people like yourselves are fortunate to be able to explore these things. But I suppose for our listeners, we've got to address that point that obviously we're talking about the use of substances which are currently illegal in this country.
yes, and wrongly illegal is the only thing I can say about it. I mean, they were made illegal for political purposes. Some say to do with the race war rather than anything to do with even health. And you're right that what's important is that they were made illegal in the 60s, let's say, and 70s worldwide with a US initiative
Mm.
under the UN Psychoactive Substances Act, I think it translated to in the UK, because they wanted to reduce kind of street use of LSD. For instance, they were finding that it was causing problems, and indeed it can. I see that in my work, that LSD can cause serious problems and traumas for people that last for decades. It does, right?
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
I
you
don't want to
froze.
get to these things if taken in the wrong way. Oh, I'm back.
Yeah, it's okay. You
Yeah,
froze for a minute. Yeah, please carry
good.
on.
So yes, so there are dangers, and we've got to be upfront and honest about those. But my message that's based on my review of the literature so far is that it's perfectly possible to take psychedelics biologically and psychologically safely, and that they then have a significant potential to help, to be therapeutic in a sense. And the problem is that the illegality applied not just to the street users, but to anybody wanting to research them. They were made
Yeah,
illegal to research as well as use, which is just diabolical, really. And that is starting to change, of course. They are currently, as you say, Lisa, and I'm sure you're aware of this, they're currently illegal, but less and less.
yeah,
There's moves worldwide. The UK is a bit reticent to get involved in this, but during the US election that we've just seen, I've been following it this morning and yesterday. You've got Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, South Dakota, Oregon, DC, all making significant moves towards decriminalization, and they followed other states that have gone before Denver. So there's a of dropping it down the police's priorities. It's not quite legalization. Sometimes it's medical marijuana, sometimes it's psilocybin, sometimes it's a bit broader than that, going in the sort of the direction of Portugal, which decriminalized and changed it to a sort of public health issue rather than a criminal issue. That again, it's a shift of metaphors, shift of ways of thinking about it. And in the UK, we're starting to see, Ben Sessa is starting to open. He's literally drilling walls in Bristol to open the UK's first psychedelic clinic there under Awaken Life Sciences. So, and then there's other things involved at King's College and Imperial, where and in Amsterdam. So closer to home, there are moves towards. So in the Netherlands, things like psilocybin truffles are easier to get hold of, and then there's Portugal, which isn't that far away. For me,
Yeah.
ayahuasca is South American, so I feel that's got further to travel somehow, metaphorically and literally. So that's perhaps a different matter. But they are becoming less and less illegal, both for research purposes and in terms of the ease of access for anybody that wants to get hold of them. But then you've got the problem that really, because set and setting and sitter is so important, people will tend to, just because of not knowing, take a substance-based approach to it. It's like, do I need LSD, or do I need psilocybin, or do I need ketamine, or do I need ibogaine? And that's not really the question in my view, because you've got to look holistically across the whole experience of who you're sitting with, what's your intention, how well prepared are you, what's your integration afterwards, and that will dictate whether you have a worthwhile experience or just a scary and difficult experience, I think.
Yeah, and I love that's where you're going, because that's what I was going to draw you on to next, is this
Hmm.
idea of the different ways in which people use this. So you and I aren't making any judgments about that, but I suppose where we're coming from is, how is this going to be useful in a boundaried, contained, safe manner? So we're giving lots of thought to it, rather than somebody being at a party and thinking, "Oh yeah, I'm going to give that a go." Not that I'm condemning that, but we are coming at it. Um, so from
Yeah,
that point of view, so
seriously, yeah.
yeah, seriously. So could you say then a bit, because we hear this all the time, and just for our listeners who don't know, set and setting.
Yeah,
Can you
yeah.
say a bit about why that's so important?
Of course. I mean, it's been there since those days of the 60s. I think it was Timothy Leary himself who came up with the notion of set and setting as a shorthand for how to trip safely, basically, or
Yeah,
usefully. What you're saying, Lucinda, is that the thoughtful use of psychedelics is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about recreational use. I mean, as you say, I've got no problem with it really, but I'm not talking about festival use. I'm not talking about taking a bunch of LSD when you're 18, particularly. It's probably a bad idea, to be honest. Do what you like, but stay safe out there. But what I'm talking about is people taking it with a more of a serious intent and a more thoughtful intent, and that involves set and setting, which I'll come to. But it's the word I like to use these days is reverent. A reverent
yes,
use of psychedelic juice. There's something about it that I really, you could say respectful, but I think reverent is just, I love the resonance of reverent of in your use of particularly ayahuasca, but other, because, and obviously I'm alluding to something a bit beyond even the psychological, to something that's a little bit transcendent, at least in its feeling. Even if you're an atheist, which I was for decades, it just introduces this notion of life purpose or ambition, or what this is all for, in a philosophical way, if not a religious way.
yeah,
So set and setting, that means set is short for mindset, and setting is the whole context under which you're taking, which is really broad, as in, where are you at in your life, where are you taking it, how near is the hospital, is worth thinking about. How safe is the context, because one way to say it is that the psychedelics really challenge your boundaries,
yeah,
and I'm speaking personally and professionally here.
yeah,
So there's a sense of, if you're going to allow your boundaries of self to be softened, or even become more permeable, or even in the terms in the case of what we call ego death, disappear entirely, then you need a strong container around that.
absolutely.
And you'd say the same in psychotherapy. We talk about the frame, right? That's the therapist provides a container so that the client can fall apart if they need to. They can completely fall apart and be in a puddle on the floor during the session. And it's the therapist's job to kind of provide some structure so that doesn't just leak everywhere and you can't gather it all back together again, metaphorically. And in psychedelics, it's sort of the same. The set and the setting are the frame. And I sometimes add to that sitter. That part, you could argue that's part of setting. But who is and obviously I'm saying somebody should be monitoring someone who's more sober, at least. I'm not necessarily saying they need to have not taken it. In ayahuasca circles, generally the shaman would take ayahuasca as well, but at it would be sometimes a lower dose, and B, they would just be more experienced. All the research suggests that you can navigate much more skillfully
Mhm.
once you have had a lot of experience. And again, I would I'm not making any huge claims for myself, but that I feel that's true for myself as well, that you have a bit more option of how in it you want to be, and how out of it you need to be. If you need to take care of someone, or someone's about to hit a candle, or can't get up to go to the toilet or something. So those things happen. So it's just about in advance having a bit of structure around the experience to make it safe. Those are well known. The way I put it is that those are quite established parameters for safety, not just for safety, but for efficacy, for effectiveness. They are well known. There are manuals online, of how to trip safely. You can just Google them. I think the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Substances Studies produces one. There's festival guides as well. Any of that, and the threads, Reddits, and things like that, will tell you how to curate a meaningful experience. But I still would say that for most people, that's beyond their. I don't know. I wouldn't prefer to do it. I prefer to pay someone to do all that stuff for me, and then I just turn up. And so, for instance, you can do that with ayahuasca in Brazil or Costa
Yeah.
Rica or in some other countries of Mexico. And then with psilocybin, you can do it in Amsterdam, and with other ibogaine, you can do it in Portugal. So, you know, the set and setting, it's not cheap. It's generally a few £1,000s. But you can either kind of do a DIY approach, which is a bit riskier but a bit more attainable for a lot more people, or you can go for an organized group where they have the experience to do it all for you, and then you just turn up.
Yeah. So there's two key points for me in what you just said. And I think what the shamanic cultures and more tribal cultures do so much better than us is this idea of reverence, is this idea of plant spirit, is this idea of the whole of the plant,
Yeah.
and the dynamic interaction of that, rather than just this kind of westernized view of what's the active ingredient here, and the idea of ceremony and ritual,
Yeah.
which isn't really about belief, but it's about bringing you into the mindset. It's bringing you into the container, as you would say,
Yeah.
bringing you into
Inviting.
that space. Yeah, absolutely. And I think those cultures do that so much better than we
Yeah.
do.
They've had a lot more experience.
Absolutely.
We burnt all our witches in the Middle Ages.
And kind of this sacredness of it, and that's nothing to do necessarily with spirituality or religion, or whether you're an atheist or not.
Yeah.
It's just the sacredness of experience, and they're taking it very, very seriously and not lightly. And the other point I'd like to pick up on that you spoke about was, my view at the minute, and you might change that within the next few seconds, which is fine. But my view in the minute is, absolutely, as you said, these experiences blend, or they break down boundaries, don't they? And so my view is that if you do not have a solid sense of self, in order for there to be ego death, there has to be an idea of ego, identity, being. There has to be a place to come back to land to. And if that's too fragmented, then I don't think this is for you necessarily. Now, you could argue that point and go, well, that could bring about some massive existential crisis that you come out the other side of, this whole idea of breaking somebody down into fragments and then bringing them all back together as a whole. But I wouldn't advise that for people that haven't really got a strong sense of self and
Yeah.
individual containment. Well,
I share that caution. Yeah, no, I
yeah,
absolutely share that caution.
yeah,
With the reservation that it's not for me to tell people what they should and shouldn't do, or
no,
can and can't
indeed.
do. That's not a position I take up, or you, I think. But if someone was to ask my opinion, that would be the exact criteria that I would ask them to invite them to really reflect on. As in, if you have any fragile sense of self, in the literature they normally talk about psychotic or history of schizophrenia, anything that's to do with a fragmentary sense of reality or self, then psychedelics, depending on the dose and depending on the substance, because you could microdose, you could have an introductory thing with something which wouldn't be so challenging. So again, it's not necessarily yes or no as much as what and when and how much. But you're right, in principle, that all of the research really agrees that that is the danger. That if you don't have a very strong container within yourself to start with, then and don't have a kind of a place you call home sort of within yourself, or sometimes I think about a kind of a boat that you're in. It's nice to dissolve into the sea for a bit, but you need to kind of climb back into your boat. If you're not used to doing that and navigating between the what you might call the transcendent and the mundane, then you might just get a bit lost. You might. I mean, there are people that just sort of never come back. As the Pulp song, isn't it? You go out and get high, but you can never come down. And I wouldn't want that personally. And I think there is the risk of it in various ways, and in various ways I could evidence both from my work and from the research. So these are hugely powerful substances.
Mm,
They're not to be taken lightly in any circumstances, really. So it's all about having good, accurate information, and then knowing yourself and being cautious, I think.
yeah, yeah, brilliant. So, can I then move you into talking about specific substances?
Yeah.
Maybe a couple, whatever you feel that are most interesting to you.
What do you want to know, Lucinda? What's your question here?
Um, so for our listeners, so we've talked about general psychedelics, but as you hinted at just now, you might use ayahuasca for a different reason than you might use psilocybin or DMT or
Yeah.
um, even medical marijuana.
Yeah.
You might use those things for very different, or ketamine. You might use
Yeah.
those for very different reasons.
Yeah.
Um, so, for instance, I know that people with chronic ongoing addictions, alcoholism, have found that doing ayahuasca has really, really helped them.
Yeah.
And I think there's some studies now on the role of ketamine working with depression. I
Yeah.
think there's something
King's
about that.
College are doing studies on that, yeah. And
Yeah,
and Silodep is a series of studies at Imperial on psilocybin for depression, yeah.
yeah. So, um, what would be your favourite ones to? I'm just mindful of time
Sure.
because we could spend a whole
Oh
day
yeah.
talking about these. Um, but
Time's
but
flying by.
indeed, but what would be your most? What are you most interested in?
Well, clearly I'm most interested in ayahuasca. I mean, I made this sign the other day for my iresearch.com. So ayahuasca is my
Well,
thing.
show us that
There's
a
there's
bit,
two,
a bit clearer, Adam.
there's
Show us that.
there's it's just I wanted to, I don't know, it's meant to be on a wall, so you can't really
Yeah, no, that's gorgeous. Great,
can't
great.
yeah, I'll put that up at some point. I There's two answers to that, really, Lucinda. One is what the research says, and the second is my critique of that research. And I'll do both briefly, like you say, given time. That what you mentioned is correct, that ayahuasca for addictions seems to be helpful, particularly in neurologically. It seems to open up your sense of identity, such as I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a heroin addict. It kind of loosens the nuts on that, or I sometimes talk about fresh snow on the slopes, so that you can make some new tracks when you're sort of stuck in a rut, and maybe have been for decades. I think that might be how it's all speculative in terms of the theory of how ayahuasca might work or other psychedelics, but that's what they seem to do, and there's some basis for that in the neuroscience. Um, psilocybin for depression, ketamine, ibogaine. I met at a conference. I met a guy who was very enthusiastic about ibogaine. That's an African psychedelic based on the iboga bush, which is, I've never taken it, don't know what it's like, but he used to be a heroin addict. Really addicted to heroin. In a proper sort of Russell Brand sort of way, and a couple of ibogaine treatments, he was out of it. He was completely, you
Amazing.
know, he was just, now he works for an ibogaine clinic. So there's that. Obviously, that's kind of a bit circumstantial, but again, there's research that suggests that in wider cohorts, there is reason to believe that this could. And again, like I say, further research needed across all of this, right? But the signs are that it's worth further investigation, both for science and maybe for individuals. That yeah, what haven't we mentioned? MDMA tends to be associated with PTSD, so that the focus of the MAPS work in America, where they're in third stage FDA, that's the people that approve or disapprove drugs, they are totally on track to legalize the medical use of MDMA for PTSD, particularly in soldiers and veterans. So they found that effective. Whether MDMA is a psychedelic or not, who knows? But it does seem to have some beneficial effect in terms of allowing people a bit of space and perspective to reflect on themselves and what's happened to them in a loving sort of way, and develop more self-compassion and more ability to cope with what's happened to them. So
Can
that's
I
MDMA.
just jump
Yeah,
in there?
yeah,
Because I heard the other day on the subject of MDMA, I heard the other day of somebody who was using it to solve their relationship issues, their partner.
right,
And because they found that they were both very competitive and combative.
right.
Um, and so they both took it and enabled much more heart opening and heartfelt communication.
Yeah,
And they were using it in that way. So
yeah.
that that was really beneficial for them,
Of
you
course. I
know.
mean, it sounds beautiful, and basically, my whole point, Lucinda, is that we should be able to use psychedelic drugs in the same way that we should be using psychiatric drugs, as in you have informed, accurate information about what they do, and then you can choose whether that's right for you, and you don't need a doctor to agree with you. And then maybe, as you just referring to your earlier point, that what the indigenous of South America and some of the ayahuasca religions do much better is community. So a Westerner tends to assume that a psychedelic trip would be a sort of one-off experience that'll either fix them or not fix them, and whereas the ayahuasca religions and other, peyote in the north, in the Native American tradition,
Yeah.
would be much more consistent. You don't just take you don't just take ayahuasca once. You take it once a month, or you take it once every 2 weeks in the Santo Daime. So and you do that within a community, and that community might go out into nature. So nature, community, and ritual. Nature, community, and ritual are three things that it's obvious to me are missing, broadly missing from a life, here in London,
Yeah.
and we can't do without them. And some of these psychedelics, again, it's not really the medical approach to talk about those things. Community is like it's in the social realm, so it's beyond their scope, really. So yeah, I think Alalaho, which has grown out of the psychedelic experiences run by the Psychedelic Society UK, and that's an all-female team over in the Netherlands they've just relaunched as Alalaho, and they talk about psychedelics as a way of life rather than a one-off, and that gets towards where I'd like, and it's a grassroots. It's not top down. Does the NHS provide it? It's bottom up. Here's a little community. It's four of us, friends, and we're offering little ceremonies to people for this much money. Where and we'll give you consistent, support, and you can come back after years, and you can have Zoom meetings with. That's the sense I have of it, and that's, I think, much more. It's just a little bit of a different model to the kind of what can be a bit of fire and forget. 15-minute GP appointments. The kind of, you can come and consult. I diagnose you as quickly as possible, and then they send you on your way, and then don't come back unless it gets worse. is one attitude, and a kind of money-based one, whereas the other is a kind of care-based attitude of what's going to really help you in the long term. So that's a model that I'm more interested in.
So can we just, in our last little while, can we just, if you're happy to, can we just move into your experience of ayahuasca? Um, what's that like? Kind of the standard sort of rituals behind that. Just
Yeah,
the kind of key points. So, because people are probably thinking, okay, so there's this ayahuasca thing. So, okay, they're legal in this country, but you kind of
yeah,
can go to South America or wherever it is to do this.
yeah.
So what should they expect?
Um, the, the general rule is go in with no expectations. So rule out everything I'm about to say.
But people
Um,
will, won't they? You know,
but
we'll say that.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm just acknowledging that it's paradoxical that, but it does allude to something important, which is that it for me every time, like speaking personally, because you're asking about that, every time it is different. It rhymes. I want to say it's not completely different, but and I could group I've done, I don't know, something like 20 or 30 ayahuasca ceremonies over the years in different formats, mostly neo-shamanic, I have to say. So not traditionally indigenous, but some kind of hybrid of taking, whether it's cultural appropriation or not remains an open question, but some kind of taking in of older traditions with some more modern things like recorded music. So traditionally, you would have live singing by the curanderas and curanderos, but these days it can often be recorded music. So it's just, it gets reinterpreted for a new age. But for my experience, so your question is, what could you expect? Again, I've been writing about the quantitative view of this, and they would say something like visions, as in a visual field, and perceptions. They would call them hallucinations. Auditory changes, where for instance, I've become aware of the of the universe. You can actually hear it. It's just, you go, oh god, it's been in the background the entire time. Now, whether that's my tinnitus from going to too many concerts when I was younger, or it's the of the universe, well, it's a matter of interpretation. But under the psychedelics, I thought it was the of the universe. And then the kind of matrices of geometric shapes is quite a typical thing. But that's kind of level one, right? And it's a bit awkward to call it a hierarchy, because it suggests that one thing's better than the other, which it isn't necessarily. I've also had experiences where it's just meditative, where it's just a very gentle rumination. You're just focusing on breathing, and you just get to think properly about all the things that are going on in your life, in the world, and that's very nice. And then on the other end of the scale is full DMT hyperspace, as some would call it, which is fully inhabiting in a 3D way an alternative reality. Andrew Gallimore, I think it is, neuroscientist of DMT, talks about the mind as a radio receiver, and it's generally tuned to this frequency of reality. And then there's lots of interference and fuzz where it kind of goes, and it's just confusing. It's just like you get a bit of fragments of voice, you get fragments of something, but none of it makes sense. But then as you get somewhere, and just like you might kind of finally find Radio 2 somewhere, the DMT tunes your mind as a radio receiver to this other frequency, which is crystal clear, and it kind of all at once, boom, it becomes as real as this, or even arguably more real, and in terms of visual perceptions, and also sort of being able to walk around it. So I've had that as well. This all comes in ayahuasca's case with a lot of vomiting, and the vomiting tends to go, they call it la purga, the purge. There's lots of purging, of sweating, of sneezing, I mean, it's pretty gross, really, all things considered. But I see that's quite beautiful these days. And most participants do as well. They come to see what you might otherwise call side effects or something, or adverse side effects even. They come to see that all as part of the journey, because it just becomes one thing where the more in the experience you are, the more you're urgently vomiting, and the more you need to go to the toilet, and the more you are struggling with your bodily, your heart racing and things like this. So that all comes as one visceral experience, and it's a series of almost, for me, a series of vignettes. A bit, for most people, it's very familiar because of their experience with dreams or just being asleep. But uh, almost like a lucid dream, it just ramps up your consciousness, kind of switches the consciousness on the back of your brain, I think, and allows you to kind of fully inhabit would otherwise be a strange dream world. Um, and it astonishes me that most people aren't terrified. That's it's just, they come back like someone who's never taken ayahuasca before, or other psychedelics will say, oh yeah, I talked to this alien insect from another dimension for a few minutes and they told me this about Jesus. And you just think, wow, it's just like that's normal to you, and they're like, yeah, yeah. So it can be all sorts of things, and all of it subject to people's own cultural and individual expectations and experiences and cultural upbringing. All feeds into that. So you might see saints. Some people would see saints, whereas the shipibo in the Amazon would be more likely to see spirits and mischievous spirits. So the language frames it a little bit, and
Yeah.
but that's the experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a key point, isn't it? We all see and interpret things through our own lens, through our own perspective. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, and that's the other thing, isn't it? We were talking about being prepared and taking this seriously and having a sense of reverence because a lot of it is very, very uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to vomit. It's
yeah,
uncomfortable to have dream diarrhea. It's uncomfortable to feel that there's nothing to hold on to. It could be potentially really, really terrifying.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so yes, I love your point about people come back from that and talk about it as though they've just gone to Tesco's.
Yeah, and what
you
what I
know,
think is wonderful about that is that if you can, there's a microcosm there. What you've just said, Lucinda, that yes, the ayahuasca experience or the psychedelic experience is really difficult, but the people I spoke to, mostly, not across the board, but mostly say, yeah, but it's worth it. It was difficult and gross and but it was worth it. And I think that's a little bit of a microcosm in 4 to 6 hours of a lifetime. That life is difficult, isn't it? It's full of challenges, some of them existential, some of them massive, death and sickness and having to be anxious all the time, or being depressed. It's horrible, a lot. And I see that in my clients, I see it in myself. And But is it worth it? That's the only question for me. And can you choose that? If you can choose to go into a psychedelic experience and say, you know what, I am willing to vomit and go to the toilet, and embarrass myself and lose my trousers, because it's worth it. Then you might be able to afterwards, in the weeks and months and years afterwards, have the same attitude to life.
yeah. And anybody who has ongoing suffering over time, and anybody that has an addiction over time and sees how devastating that is to their
Yeah,
family, to themselves, to their soul. Um, yeah, I think that's the pertinent question, isn't it? It's worth going through maybe a couple of hours, few hours of hell.
it could
Um,
be.
could be, yeah, to come out
You
of
know,
the other side with
yeah.
some new awareness.
Yeah, and practicing with that. Ayahuasca is traditionally known as the vine of the dead. So it's really, I mean, it doesn't pull any punches really, generally. That it's a rehearsal, for dealing with one of the, if not the most pressing and difficult things, which is the prospect of death and dying. And to be able to rehearse that a little bit, I find that profoundly worthwhile. Even if it is very, very scary, I'm glad that I'll have, a bit like going on stage or something. It's very scary but very important, and I enjoy it afterwards, and I'm glad I did it afterwards. But beforehand, I'm full of anxiety and nervousness and not sure I can do this. And it's the same for me. That question will be asked of each of us, of I suppose I'm going to say something a bit more personal about it, Lucinda. Is that's the question that keeps coming up for me in my journey, is where I'm at with it. Of can I lean into death? Can I choose death for myself? And can I let go at the right time? And am I able to do that, in a dignified way? and the jury's still out. I don't know yet.
Yeah. And funny, you should bring in that point. Was asked to do a training the other day about the process of death and dying.
Mm.
And me being me, I did it from a very different kind of bit of a controversial angle.
Excellent.
In that I spoke about uh, terminal lucidity, near-death experiences, stuff like that. Because I I think that this is another thing that we're missing in the West is that death is hidden. And there are many different kinds of deaths. We die all the time, don't we? Things end, nothing's
Well, the
ever
past is all
permanent.
dead. Yeah.
Exactly. So things are rising up, coming into being, and then fading away all the time. And yet we have a real issue. I mean, look at all this nonsense that's going on in the world now, generated the world, not just our country, generated by fear, because we've got this idea that we're going to live forever. This illusion, and that we need to keep somebody alive no matter what state of being they're in. As long as you have life, then you have everything. And that's not necessarily the case, is it? Existentialism absolutely looks at quality of life and what it means to be human and what we need to be sustained as humans.
I
And
think
so,
we've each got a choice. Do you want to learn that the easy way or the hard way? And psychedelics for me is the easy way, actually.
yeah, yeah. So, what are you hoping will come out of your research? Why are you doing it? Why are you doing a PhD and putting yourself through all that agony?
It is agony, yeah.
Because it is agony.
It's a lot of work, but yeah, I love it. I'm so happy to be doing the PhD with the supervisor and Jonathan Smith and the cohort and colleagues that I have at Birkbeck. It's I feel like I'm in a transformative experience with the PhD, which is I love it. I love my client work, and I love the PhD, despite it being very challenging and hard. What am I hoping for from it? Steve Jobs talked about making a dent in the universe, and that's something that drives me forwards in some significant way. What dent do I want to make in this universe? Well, it's just gently. I've no delusions of grandeur here. I'm not gonna single-handedly change significant numbers of people's attitudes towards this. I don't think, but I'm willing to try. And part of it is just setting out what happens. That's it. I'm not even trying to persuade anybody. I don't want anybody to take psychedelics that isn't up for it. And if you're against it, or it's like drugs equals no, fine, right? Don't worry. What I'm hoping for is a sort of libertarian attitude and a political shift, if I'm honest, so that the people that do want to take the psychedelics are able to, and the people that don't kind of go, well, none of my business really. Doesn't hurt me, doesn't harm me. And that number would increase over time. Or in terms of informed consent, I'm trying to give more people access to that based on accurate information, when there's been so much over the past few decades politically informed propaganda, basically, from grain chills, just say no, to the war on drugs. And this is my little contribution to humanity. PhD is meant to be a little bit of an offering of something original or new. That's my hope, is just to humbly offer some insights into people's experience of psychedelics, maybe ayahuasca particularly, and what they took from it, so that they can make their own minds up. And I want to do that as fairly and transparently and in balanced way as possible, so that I'm not a cheerleader for it and I'm acknowledging the risks, but so that people can make up their own minds.
Okay, and my last question is, what do you think's come out of our discussion for you today? How would you kind of summarize where we've ended up?
Yeah. Well, I said to you just ahead of the call, I wonder what I'm going to say, and yeah, I'll be interested to watch the recording to find out what I said. It's always it's astonishing to hear, for me to hear, and this is the whole psychedelic thing, to hear what I'm saying, for me to hear what I'm saying. I think therapy is about that as well, Lucinda, that you
Yes.
get to hear what what you're saying because you're saying it to someone else.
Yes.
And they just act as the medium of self-reflection in this dynamic, right? So that's
Yeah.
what's happening between you and me. I'm getting to discover what's important to me via you, which I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And none of what I've said is new to me, but it has emerged in a much clearer way. And that's what without some of it's the neurons in my brain. It feels like some of them are starting to align in a kind of ones that fire together, wire together, in some kind of coherence, which I like, and I like it, and I'm persuading myself in this conversation that this is a worthwhile endeavor. So it's always good to rehearse. I think for anybody, Lucinda, it's good to rehearse. Why are you doing what you're doing? It's a great question for a client, isn't
Be
it?
reminded. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, and is it still valid why you think you're doing what you're doing? As I said, for me, working in marketing, it was no longer valid, but I still carried on with it for about a decade. If you check against that, like, am I being my best self? Am I on the right track here? That's what I've taken from it, Lucinda. That it's Saturday morning. It's a sort of sleepy start to the weekend for me. That it's just reassuring, and I'm grateful for the reassurance that this is what matters, and some stuff is coming together in some way that may be useful to others, and that's brilliant.
Well, you have been wonderfully articulate and so informative and so fascinating. And I'm sure our audience, as big and small as it is, are going to agree with me. So, when do you hope to complete your PhD? When do you hope it all to be done and dusted?
I never want it to end because I'm enjoying it so much, and my wish may be granted because of coronavirus and other delays. But I'm doing it part time because I'm working as well. So the timeline is 5 or 6 years from
Yeah,
now.
yeah. So you've really just begun, really.
I've just started my second year, and it was a slow first year because of the year of coronavirus when universities were just figuring out how on earth to deal with any of this.
Yeah.
So on top of the usual difficulties of starting a PhD, so I yeah, but for me, it's not, again, it's not a fire and forget thing. Like during the process, there will be milestones and there will be things I can say. So watch this space. If anybody's interested in signing up to my mailing list on iresearch.com, go to iresearch. Maybe I'll keep this. Go to iresearch.com and sign up to the mailing list there, and then I'll just publish. I'm trying to sort of vlog the journey, or just have some kind of sharing my work sort of sense to it, which is two-way. That's not just me announcing stuff. That I want to hear from other people. I want to hear what they're interested in and what their questions are, what their critique is of what I'm doing. Very up for that. It's all dialogue. And and therefore, if you do that, you would keep up to date with where my research is going, where it's up to, and how it might pivot. My idea of it today may be well different to what it is in a year's time.
Brilliant. Okay. So, wise ones out there, that's our Ask It question for today, talking with Adam Knowles about his research into psychedelics. So, thank you so much, Adam, for joining me today. Bless you.